Hey everybody, welcome to Heroic Studios Gaming. I'm your host Scott here of Heroic Studios. How's it going? Just coming at you again with another video. This is my book corner for the month of July, and it's the book corner in which I'm going to talk about some sort of monster hunting book because this is basically my Monster Hunter month or Hunter month, for those of you that are unaware. And to this month, I am not going to disappoint you. I am going to talk about the book that I said I was going to talk about during Vampire Month and then changed my mind because I realized that it was a bad idea. So here we are with 13 Bullets. I bought this book many years ago. It still has the dot from when I had it in the fraternity library back in college. So this is obviously something I've had for a while. But yeah, this book is an interesting book, and I'll tell you about it. So 13 Bullets is a book by David Wellington, as you can see here. He's the author of a book series called Monster Island, which I hadn't even heard of, actually, even until recently. I had it written right there, and it wasn't until I finished this book again recently to be able to review it for you guys that I realized that he had written another series that you cannot find on Audible, and I also can't find in physical print. So I don't know what that's all about, but David Wellington, from what I understand in his own introduction in this book and from online stuff, is he was actually publishing from 2002 to 2006, basically almost entirely online through, I think it was called Broken Type or something like that. He was doing an online publication kind of business. And he was publishing, at least for this book, I don't know what the other ones, but for this book, each chapter every week or so. And so he was doing that thing that some writers do that I've seen in TV, essentially, where they publish chapter by chapter each week, and then they get feedback from their fans and that sort of thing. So that's what he was doing to publish this book. And you can kind of tell there's some bits that seem a little weird, and the reason they seem weird is because it seems like some aspect that he kind of wasn't really going to talk about suddenly becomes highly more important, or there's this weird change that sort of happens in the story. But overall, the story is pretty good. So 13 Bullets follows the story of State Trooper Laura Caxton, who in the very beginning gets set off on a course that changes basically her entire life. It's set in a world that is very similar to ours with some differences, and those differences are kind of interesting. The world that she lives in, they know that vampires and potentially other supernatural things are real. There are some things that are clarified in the book, like vampires are definitely real, and then ghosts are real. That's for sure, because there's this whole bit with protoplasm that they do where they go visit someone who figures out that she's inherently psychic, based on the the skin of ghosts reacting to her presence, essentially. So ghosts are obviously real. And then she questions whether or not werewolves are real, and the guy who she's talking to, who's her man, who really only knows more about vampires, by the name of Jameson Arkley, that's his name. Jameson Arkley, he kind of gives her a kind of thing where he doesn't actually clarify that werewolves are real or not. But I know that David Wellington later went on to write a series about werewolves, so I assume that in his world that's a thing. In his universe. So 13 Bullets is the story of State Trooper Laura Caxton, who is doing a routine traffic stop and ends up finding some dead bodies in the trunk of a car. The driver of the car takes off, and it turns into this sort of manhunt for this person. But the bodies are very clearly have been sort of dismembered and whatnot. And the person that I'm chasing, they find out because he loses a limb or something that he's a half-dead. And half-deads are the result of vampires killing a person, not turning them into a vampire, and then sort of raising them from the dead. And the reason why they didn't turn them into a vampire in his world is because becoming a vampire is a different kind of process than you typically find with vampire stories. In vampire stories, usually somebody that's bitten by a vampire becomes a vampire, or somebody who was bitten by a vampire and then fed on the vampire blood becomes a vampire. There's some sort of process like that, right? In this series, and this is the interesting thing, in this series, a person becomes a vampire by first getting the vampire into their head. So if for some reason the vampire dominates you, or you look into their eyes or whatever, you get some sort of psychic transmission from the vampire, and then you commit suicide, you become a vampire. So vampires are only made by suicide attempts that are made after a person gets the vampire in their brain. So first you have to get the vampire in your brain, then you commit suicide, then you become a vampire. And so there's this process vampires do if they want to make other vampires. If they don't want to make other vampires, they just kill you outright. Because if they kill you, then you don't come back as a vampire. It doesn't happen. That doesn't work that way. Like, you have to kill yourself in order to become a vampire. So they're totally fine. Like, just, they could dominate people and then kill them because it doesn't matter. But what they then can do is they do this little enchantment, which isn't really explained in this first book. And I think, because I know I have the second book and I kind of started it, but I don't think it's explained in the second book either. I don't think it's until the fourth book. There's 4 in the series that they actually explain this thing. But all that David Wellington sort of explains it as is some kind of enchantment that vampires kind of know. And the reason that they kind of know it is because they get into your brain before you become a vampire, right? So when a vampire gets into your brain before you become a vampire, you will then become a vampire, but that the sort of mind meld essentially is still there. So your vampire master or whatever has implanted their knowledge and information in your head, and there's a little piece of them that sort of lives in your mind forever. And so there's that little bit. And so that information that vampire has kind of becomes knowledge that you have. So somehow all vampires know, whichever vampire figured out how to raise the dead from the dead with their abilities, then just every time they made a vampire afterwards, all of those vampires knew how to do it. So they can raise these sort of zombies that are called half-dead. So not zombies per se, because they still can think and they still can act. They just are rotting corpses that are falling apart. And so eventually, after about a week or so, they're useless and they just kind of collapse and fall apart unless, for whatever reason, their half-body parts become useful for whatever reason, which does happen in the book, where there's some that are just buried in the ground and all they're doing is sort of clawing up like crazy zombies to try to claw at her as she runs through the forest, right? So this is the world of vampires, which is a very interesting, different kind of world. And the other interesting, different kind of thing with this is the necessity for blood. So vampires in this story, they do, when daytime comes, they don't just go to sleep. They actually discorporate. They actually just turn into bits of goo. Their whole body just becomes this massive goo, except for their heart. It's the only thing that stays. And the bones, right? Because the bones don't disintegrate. But all the fleshy bits just become translucent gooiness. And which is weird, but it's sort of like what happens to he actually describes it as this. Caxton is told by Arkley that the reason for this is similar to the way that a caterpillar becomes a butterfly, where a caterpillar goes into the cocoon and then they basically become bits of floaty goo, and then they come back together and they become a butterfly. And that's sort of what he says, is that this transition from being human to vampire involves this sort of stage of metamorphosis where they're in this gooey bit, but that happens every day for a vampire, and then they reconstitute every night, and so that they're healed. All of the damage that they've taken, anything that's going on with them, just goes away because they reconstitute in the morning, right, or in the nightfall, like at sundown. Which is an interesting take on vampires, but it also puts them more into the bug sort of worm category of like supernatural things. So they're not really they're not humans anymore. They're some kind of other entity that's a mix between human and, butterfly, essentially. But it's worms. It's all like worms and maggots and stuff. And it's this way that he wanted to be kind of gross about it. But it's interesting because the older vampires have just like maggots. They're essentially like accumulation of like a swarm of maggots, essentially, and then they constitute into a human each day or each night. But anyway, so this necessity for blood, much like a leech or a tick, like they need the blood to survive. And when they get the blood, they become incredibly strong, and they become incredibly strong, incredibly fast, incredibly powerful, and they're hard to kill. Like their skin becomes like stone, and then they just sort of cementifies due to the blood. So they can only be killed when they have not drank blood. When they're out of blood for whatever reason, that's when they can be killed. If you try to kill a vampire right after they've fed, you're boned. Like, you can't touch them. You could drop a nuke on them and it probably wouldn't kill them. That's the level of like dangerousness that goes on. And there's like stuff like that. Like Arkley believes that if he were to fire a missile at a vampire right after it fed, it would have zero effect. But there's many times in the story where they try to attack a vampire after it's fed and it just kind of shakes off. Like the bullets bounce off, or the stake they're trying to drive into start just smashes into pieces, or like the metal that they try to jam into it just bends. Like none of it really affects the vampire, right? But then when they're not on blood, or when they're in their sort of weird gooey state, they can be killed very easily. So they have to protect themselves, which is why they have half-deads, right? These beings that can kind of be around them. So it's a very interesting story. But the reason it's called 13 Bullets for David Wellington's spike purposes, the reason it's called 13 Bullets is because the bullets that are most effective against vampires are not silver or any kind of special thing. They are cross-cut bullets, illegally, like against the Geneva Convention, cross-cut bullets, because they break into like these pieces and sort of cause massive internal body damage, which is exactly what you want when you want to attack a thing that seems to shake off, massive amounts of damage. So he has these illegal bullets, but he can only fit 13 of them in his Glock 20, and so that's the reason it's called 13 bullets. Because 13 bullets is the maximum number of rounds of ammunition he can have in his gun at a time. And with the magazine, and then he doesn't load one in the chamber. So she's like, "Why don't you just always have one in the chamber?" He's like, "Because I can't reliably assume that there's one in the chamber. I have to assume there's not one in the chamber. Because if I assume there's one in the chamber and I go to fire and there isn't one, I'm dead." And so he has to assume that he can only have 13. And so that's the idea, right? But then that also is basically like he's essentially lets on to the idea that you will not have time to reload, right? So 13 is the number of bullets that you have, and that's it. And you should always assume that you only have 13, because if you have other magazines and you survive long enough to be able to change magazines, great, but probably not. So don't rely on it. So it's a very interesting story from that side of this whole thing, where there's this monster hunter in a world where monsters have been confirmed, but there are very few vampires left. And the reason why Laura Caxton is pulled into this, not just because she found it, because before her, Jameson Arkley was the only other person in the United States, part of law enforcement, who had even actually ever seen a vampire. And he had also dealt with the same thing. He actually killed a bunch of vampires at one point. And he's a federal marshal. So he's a U.S. Marshal and she's a state trooper. And because she gets involved, he shows up and he's like, "Well, you're with me now." And she's like, "Why?" And he's like, "Because you're the only person who decided, like, instead of chasing after the guy so that he could elude everyone, circle back, take the car, and drive away, you're the only one who stayed with the vehicle and had the foresight to think he's going to want to come back for these." And so he's like, "So you're obviously the smartest trooper, and therefore I want you." And that's why she ends up part of the story, because she's just a clever trooper. But it's a very interesting story. There's also a whole lot about her personal life and her relationship, and that actually comes back full circle at the end of the book. All of this stuff about her. Turns out she was far more important to the story than we thought. And at the very end, the last couple of chapters, it becomes very clear that there was a lot more going on in the background that we didn't know about. And on second read, you can see those things happening, that he very cleverly wrote some things going on in the background. So he outlined the book before he wrote it. Or, and this is more likely, is that when he was publishing it chapter by chapter online, he sort of developed the story, and when it ended, he then went back, and before putting it out in publication form, he went back and like fixed it so that some of the things that came out at the later showed up earlier. But I don't care, because by the time somebody like me consumed it, he'd already figured out the story and he'd already circled back and like put all those things back in, which is still very smart, because if I had done that, if I'd written the whole story out and then put it in there and then showed it off to people, same effect. So to me, it means the same thing. So I give it 2 thumbs up, and I do recommend it. It is still available. But it is, I will say, there's one caveat. It is self-published, and you can tell. There's a few moments where there's some exposition that probably goes on a little too long, or some editing work that might have been nice to sort of clarify a few things here and there, or fix a few things here and there. But otherwise, it is still pretty dang good. Even though it was picked up by Three Rivers Press, there's still that sort of feel of sort of self-publishing with it. So that's the only caveat, but I still give it 2 thumbs up, and I would say go ahead and read it if you want to read something different about how to fight and kill vampires, because it's very good. Very good. So that's it for me. I hope to hear from you guys again, hear about your haunted experiences / hunting history. I'm just kidding. None of you have hunting history, but that's fine. Anyway, I will talk to you all later.